This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
This is Sarah, and I just want to take a moment to speak to you about this week's sponsor, Favor. Favor, Inc. is a statewide family-led nonprofit 501c3 organization that is committed to empowering families as advocates and partners in improving educational and health outcomes for our children. Favor is the Connecticut state organization of the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health. Favor offers a single place for families with children who have medical, mental, emotional, and behavioral health challenges to find information, assistance, and training. To find out more about Favor, please go to favor-ct.org. We are grateful for our opportunity to work with Favor as a sponsor, and now on to the rest of the episode.
This episode is brought to you by CogniView. CogniView provides cognitive assessment tools to a broad range of healthcare providers for the early detection of cognitive impairment. Early detection allows patients to address modifiable risk factors sooner, potentially changing the course of cognitive decline. It also allows healthcare providers to develop a plan with the patient and caregiver so the patient can live their best life during their journey. For more information, go to www.cognivue.com. That's www.cognivue.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Caregiver Chronicles. My name is Sarah, and today I have Kathryn Betts Adams with me. Kathryn is a former clinical social worker and social work professor. She's also a gerontologist, essayist, researcher, and author of the memoir, Pianist's Only Daughter.
Hi,
Hi.
Sarah. Thanks for having me to your podcast.
Thank you so much for being here. You are Dr. Kathryn Betts Adams. My apologies in that introduction.
That's okay. I got my doctorate in social work back in 2000. So that's when I went on to teach social work. But before that, I was a clinical social worker. And I was a mom. I have two grown kids. And then I ended up kind of retiring a little bit early to follow my husband around the country for his work. And while doing that, I've been doing writing essays, and then as it happened, caring for my parents in their later years. And that became a very intensive experience just over time, with both of them needing different things at different times. And eventually I wrote this book, The Pianist's Only Daughter. My father's the pianist, so that's thus that. And all about how I found, sort of dealing with my own parents aging, as someone who was already a professional social worker. I'd actually worked in nursing homes. I'd worked in mental health. I had done research on older adults. But when it came time to help my own parents, I found it very challenging for a number of reasons. And that was kind of the impetus, the start for me to think, maybe I have a story here. Because, if I'm having trouble, if I'm finding this overwhelming, if I'm disappointed in the care services that I can find for my mom, for example, I know I'm not the only one. I mean, I know there's people out there. And so I kind of wanted to share my story from that perspective. This is hard. I learned a lot from being, in the role of caregiver, as more than I had in some cases from being a professional. I really thought I would be so good at this, I'll be so good. Well, it was not, I mean, I did bring a lot to it, but I found it was taxing to me, as you know, as any kind of caregiving. And the thing is, I sometimes feel almost embarrassed because I didn't actually care for my parents in my own home as some people do, or, move in with a parent. My dad did move in with us for about, I guess it was about 18 months. So he did live with us, but he was still relatively independent at that point. He was getting, so he needed a little oversight. He certainly, didn't go buy his own groceries or anything. I did all that, did his laundry, but I wasn't like caring for a parent who needed a lot of hands-on care. Um, my mother had Parkinson's. We sort of were building up to where she was not doing as well, and I was trying to convince my parents to move because they were in a house in the country with this long driveway and in Minnesota. So winters, you can imagine, long driveway, and it was just a regular house, although the fortunate thing was they'd had a first floor bedroom and bathroom and the laundry. It was all right there. So it was kind of nice for an older couple, except that with Parkinson's, her movement was getting a little bit less steady, and the house wasn't well set up for using a walker or a wheelchair. There were stairs to go in. And anyway, the whole thing was I was just sort of like, my fingers were crossed that it was all going to be okay. And I was trying to convince them, especially my father. So that was kind of one element of the book, was just getting to the point where they would get the correct sort of placement, or, move somewhere where she would be safer and more secure. Unfortunately, she fell and broke her hip. And then that was like the big crisis where she had to move. She was in the hospital at first and then had to go to rehabilitation. And just a whole series of things occurred where we kept facing disappointment, because then they kind of officially diagnosed her as having Parkinson's dementia, even though, to my view, it was not as severe as someone with Alzheimer's, but yet she could not remember certain things, and importantly, she kept trying to get up when she really couldn't walk, and that's, I guess, not that uncommon. So she was kind of endangering herself that way. She needed supervision. Um, so we had to end up with, a specialized memory care placement, and she was still in the wheelchair, so it was really hard to try to bring her home. So things like that you can just see. And then, the story goes on where I actually, later, my father needed more help, and he was always kind of the difficult one, where you have a parent that you really love, you really have kind of a nice rapport with in some ways, but in other ways, they are a little bit too controlling. They're a little bit self-centered. They have high expectations. They think, if there's anything wrong, quick, you got to help me. You got to get me out of here. And he was like that. Unfortunately, after he had a fall and had to be in a nursing care and then assisted living. And it was very unfortunate because he had all that happen during COVID, and then there was not a lot of in-person visiting. So it was like I'd had this whole experience with my mom, and then I had the whole experience with my dad. And so it kind of makes a story because of how it all unfolded. And then the second sort of major theme, other than how it was difficult dealing with services in later life, even for someone who is a professional, the other theme is just that, as I've now kind of coined the phrase, every family caregiving story is a family story. In other words, who you were as a family is going to affect how you deal with things later in life. So I decided that this would make a better story if I went back to the beginning and told about, the start of our family and who my parents really were. And I think that makes it a richer story. The fact is, both of them were kind of unusual for their time. He was trying to be a concert pianist, and his parents were very, very almost like pushy, but very enthusiastic about his piano talent. And he was sort of like, they were like stage parents to some extent. And he was very talented. And then when my mother was young, she was very interested in the arts and literature and writing, and her family wasn't really that way, and they didn't really understand it. And so she kind of was a little bit of an outlier in her family. They both were raised in New Jersey. And when they met, it was just like fireworks. They're like, oh, wow, this beautiful person who's all artsy. And they got together, they were in love. Then, of course, things were not perfect. The honeymoon was over. My father did not want any children. And it was kind of a sore point. My mother had agreed because she was young and in love. And then she was like, I really would like to have a baby. And so luckily that was me. So I was the one. I like that story. Of course, the stories like that sort of stick with a person because you realize, and actually it was my dad's choral director from high school who was like a great mentor to him. So this was later after he was married. They went for a walk, and my father said, I want to be a pianist. I want to be an artist. I don't want to have a baby. Jane wants a baby. And this guy said, Dawn, you could have one, you could let her have one baby and it'll be all right. Just one. You just take one child anywhere. It's not a big deal. It's not going to interrupt your life too much. And so that was me, right? So anyway, unfortunately, then we go through some years. It kind of goes quick in the book, but I sort of describe all the things that happened. We had a lovely cabin. My dad had a way of falling in love with other women, unfortunately. And eventually my parents divorced. And I was like 15. And the interesting thing is, in between, my dad remarried. He had a son who's my half brother. And I had a really nice relationship with his wife, who was not that much older than I am. And I call her Sharon in the book. Some of the names were changed sort of to protect people's privacy. When Sharon decided to divorce my dad, or they got divorced, my dad, within like months, came to see my mom and wooed her back. And she was single, and here she was. She had Parkinson's disease. She was almost 70. She had already decided to sell her house. We'd helped her through that. She had come to live near us. She was enjoying our kids and being a nice grandma. And he came, and then she decided to go back with him to Minnesota. And they lived together relatively happily for the next 13, 14 years until her decline that I already mentioned. So it's quite the story of these two. It was almost like they sort of developed this legend about themselves, or mythology, like they were destined to be together, but he was funny because he said to me, she's pretty overweight now. She's pretty heavy, but when I look in her eyes, she's still the same. And I'm like, oh, that's nice, because he sort of always wanted everybody to just look just so, especially women, right? Whereas my mom just said, oh, he was the love of my life. So she was a goner. She just went, and she just so there was a lot, even then I was really having to help my husband. I luckily have a lovely husband all through this. My husband and I had to do a lot just even to help with that, helping her come to live near us, then helping her to move back to Minnesota, and then kind of offering support. And then all the really more serious stuff started happening a little later on. So
I think I want to go back to something you said in the beginning where you talked about how, you had a background in social work and you had worked in nursing homes, but
yeah,
you still felt unprepared for
yeah,
everything when you were in the thick of it. Like in the beginning, when you first get that piece of paper of the diagnosis, and I can relate to this as someone who, I was a CNA for 17 years.
right.
And a medication aide. So when it comes to certain things with my kids, it's like I can handle diaper changes. I can handle medication management because I did it. And then
Right.
there's times where it's like, holy crap, I was really not prepared for this. Um,
Right.
you know, can you talk a little bit more about that feeling and if you think that feeling is kind of normal in healthcare communities and maybe just not talked about?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I found it hard, and I have worked with people, and then later my dad's lady friend after my mom had passed had Alzheimer's, and I know the sadness of which I haven't experienced as much firsthand, of having someone not recognize you, that kind of thing, and realizing how little, you know, the person really remembers. But with my mom, I found that it really sort of hurt. It was almost like when you have a child that has a problem. I was sort of taking it rather personally, like, this is my mom. She's an intelligent woman. She had her PhD in English literature. She wrote poetry. She taught in college. And here she is. She's in a wheelchair. She can't walk. And now, sort of add insult to injury, they're giving her this diagnosis of dementia. And I still see her as the same as she was. Like she still got so much of that, but she also, there's part of her mind that isn't right. And I had to admit that, but it was hard. It was hard to I felt sort of resentful, like, why do they have to do that? Because it actually ended up meaning that she and my father couldn't really live together in the same assisted living, because it was kind of like she needed the more secure, and he didn't want to go and do that and live with her, secure, which would have cost a lot anyway, more. So our system is kind of rough that way. I really was sad at that time. It was like one of the sad moments. And so where she was placing her in a dementia unit that turned out was really for rather, I would say moderate to severe dementia. And she just did not fit there very well. And especially to me, because I remembered her as she was, and I saw her still having a little bit of spark. She still enjoyed, doing word puzzles. And, we had to sort of make more simple things. We got her simple crosswords, simple word puzzles, the kinds of things that she used to do that were like the New York Times. Now she would do simple things. She did very simple jigsaw puzzles, but a lot of the people in that unit really weren't very verbal or anything. And so I didn't let that go on for too long. I really struggled for a while. And that's one of the times where I felt like this is a lot of responsibility for one person, because I had to try to figure out, where can she go? And my dad too. They both need to be somewhere. And they've sold their house. And so yeah, there were a few low moments there, even though, and also sadly, I don't mean sadly for us, but sadly, a lot of people don't have the resources that we had. My parents each had, teaching jobs, so they each had, some good retirement monies. And I had the resources from a husband who was working full time, who, which allowed me to fly back and forth a few times and not have to be, strapped for funds. And it was still hard. So we had more choices because we had some more money, but it somehow the choices still weren't perfect.
I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. And you're right
Sure.
on that too. The quality in it, and it's so just like frustrating that it is this way, and it shouldn't be
Mhm.
this way, and it's disheartening for
Yeah.
everybody. But we all
Yeah.
know at the end of the day,
Mhm.
the more financial resources you have, the better insurance you have access to, the better healthcare you get, hands down.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and it's unfortunate because it doesn't matter where you are on the economic totem pole. We'll say you're still human,
Yeah.
and you
Right.
still deserve great resources. But despite that, even people with all the resources, and I've spoken to people, I'm very privileged that I get to speak to people on the show from all walks of life and
Yeah.
all different
Right.
backgrounds, in all different career paths. And I was speaking to somebody who had a friend who was a senator who could not find proper
Mhm.
placement for his mother when she had a problem and needed support. And it's like
Yeah.
this is a person who probably has better insurance than anybody in the world,
Right.
probably
Right.
has access to way more resources than my family does, and they still can't get the right
Yeah.
help. So how disheartening is it for the rest of us?
Mhm. Mhm.
And that's
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing that caregivers, and I don't care if you're how familiar you are with the system, you're just never prepared for that.
Right. Right. And I think a lot of what, I sort of talk about in the book, that as I go through all the things that happened, it it's part of that. You kind of hold several feelings at once, and I think I tried to write about that so that, it's not all one way. You're both sort of upset with your like, I would be upset with my father because he wasn't always the easiest person, and yet I was also upset with the system, and yet I also was guilty and mad at myself for somehow not being better prepared or doing a better job. And that's so common that, we sort of blame ourselves when in fact we're in a, kind of a no-win situation. It's not our fault that maybe the care options aren't optimal or perfect for our what we really need, or what the parents need, or but also aging and some of these chronic illnesses, nobody is going to be that happy or comfortable or really do well. It's one of those sad realities sort of about the cycle of life. Some people live a long life and then they have a short illness and they die, and they don't have that struggle of chronic illness, or, a decline that's really sort of painful to go through. But a lot of people do. And unfortunately, both of my parents did. And it was hard to watch. And I kept wanting to sort of fix things. And of course, part of it was just their condition, was just, you really can't fix that condition. All you can do is, be your best with them and try to be patient, and, give them the best care placement that you can. And so, yeah.
Absolutely, though. But you're right, that's all you can do is try your best.
Right.
And
Right.
and again, like, you mentioned caregiver guilt.
Yeah.
I think that there is a whole other level of caregiver guilt for people, again, who've worked in healthcare systems.
Yes.
We just have higher expectations of ourselves. And that can, that can make guilt worse, right? Like,
Yeah.
what were your expectations? And if you're not meeting them, and it
Mhm.
might not even be your fault, and it usually isn't. Um,
Right.
but that's just
Right.
the way of the system. I want to talk about too, you mentioned that your parents are these artsy, creative
Yeah.
poets, pianists, people in
Mhm.
the healthcare system, in healthcare facilities, even a lot of long-term care facilities and healthcare systems, they aren't necessarily catered to that.
Right.
They can be very, forgive my choice of words, and please know that I am not anti long-term care. I am very pro
No.
anti long-term care if it's what's right for you or your family. You got to
Right.
do what's best for you, your family, your situation. But I know long-term care facilities, especially like locked dementia units, can be
Mhm.
very sterile, clinical places in kind of matter of fact, and just I don't and that had to really play a role in placement. It's very hard to find a long-term care facility that's brightly colored and,
Yes.
just like mentally and visually stimulating for someone like that. How or did you manage that, and how did you manage that with the system?
Well, again, my mother was in this place in Minnesota. My dad had an apartment in their independent living unit. He could just walk over indoors through hallways and up an elevator and then go see her. So it was like, perfect. Except when they moved her to the dementia care unit, it was not like that. It was pretty dull, and the people who worked there were kind, and they did some things. They showed some movies sometimes, and they had, music playing, but it was sort of at a level of not, it wasn't catering to people who had a real background in the arts at all. And I also thought it was catered to a really low functioning level, unfortunately. So I finally did decide to move. My husband and I decided to help my parents move to California, where we were living. Now we're in Connecticut, but for about 5 years, my husband was working in California, and I was out there with him. And so we moved my dad in with us, and we moved my mother to a place that was a memory care facility, like freestanding. It was just by itself, and it's kind of a regional chain out there. So for profit, cost a lot of money, but it was very nice. And they had a lot of like local arts groups came in and did shows, or a little, not a whole show, but did a little presentation or some music. They did flower arranging and painting and things for the people who were able to do it. And they had like travelogue time with slides. So it was a lot more activity and things for the people. And so I felt like my mother would do really well there. And she did, until her condition was such that she really, really needed to go to a nursing home. And then she passed not too long after that. And so in a way, I started to feel that, the nursing care there was not as intense as she probably needed, since she was wheelchair bound and really could hardly move. And Parkinson's is so insidious. It just creeps up, and she really probably needed more medication than she'd been getting. And it was really hard to get, even though this is this lovely place and they have a nice facility and great activities and staff. The thing about the medication and the nursing care was frustrating in that instance. So anyway, we went through some of that. And then when my dad fell here in Connecticut and had to just go, I just had to put him where he could get in. And then it ended up that he ended up staying there, but moved from their nursing home rehab to their assisted living. But it was kind of an intensive assisted living, because he really couldn't, he was pretty much dependent in all ADLs other than eating. He could eat, he was still talking, and he did not have dementia, maybe a little tiny bit for someone in their 90s, but his physical, he was just not good, and so that was hard for him, because he was very frustrated. It was kind of like he couldn't get out, and oh boy. Anyway, I think a lot of us who've been through this, I don't mean to say that it's like as much as like when you say like PTSD, but there's sort of a mild PTSD. We've been mildly traumatized by some of the things that have happened to our loved one, and things that we've witnessed, decisions that we've made when we felt like maybe it wasn't the best in retrospect, or things didn't work out. And I know it's similar to having children, but somehow with children, if they're, things are a little more routine. This is like new things are sort of hitting you all the time, and because you're not really trained. Nobody tells you what to expect exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree with that. And also I would say like too, even when people do tell you what to expect or what to give advice for, that's advice for what worked for them.
Right.
At the end
Right.
of the day, every single person is different
Yeah.
and has different needs and different
Yeah.
expectations and different, just different things. And I want to just touch back really quick. You talked about, it seems like there is a disconnect in long-term care, and I feel like I've seen this too, where either you're getting that extra activity stimulation and stuff, but then maybe the nursing care just isn't there at all the levels that it needs to be,
Mhm.
or vice versa. And that is a real big problem we have in the healthcare system.
Yeah.
There's definitely not enough activity aids and not enough people willing to work and and research and find activities and programs for people with more, and who have dementia that maybe
Yeah.
can be done with a variety of skill levels.
Yeah.
And that's, you know,
Or or
that's
for people with, poor health, but who still have their minds, that too I felt was kinda lacking for my dad, and of course, that was during COVID, so it was a little hard to be too judgmental. I kept sort of trying to, give the give the facility sort of a pass because I knew it was COVID and things were tough, but I still felt like, he spent an awful lot of time just alone in his room, just, without even often, I mean, they because of COVID, they wouldn't even let people come out of their rooms for quite a while. I mean, that was tough. And I wrote about all that here, knowing that, of course, it was pretty much over, but you just never know. Something else might happen, and I kinda hope that maybe, the way we run our long-term care facilities, if there's another, God forbid, type of pandemic thing or something, maybe it won't be quite so rigid and strict for the people, because not allowing any caregivers to come in just seemed to me to be just a terrible way to run a nursing home or an assisted living facility. So, um, I guess the third theme in my book, I just wanted to mention, it's not all just about caregiving exactly, but it's partly about sort of my relationship with my parents and kind of how, you expect certain things, you have certain hard feelings as you're growing up, and then you kind of go through life. And by the time, especially with my dad, which is why I called it the pianist's only daughter, it seemed like we sort of came full circle. And I was able to accept him a little more in terms of just who he was, and not feel like, oh, he should have been different. He should have been more attentive. He should have been, a better dad. He should have been a better husband to my mom the first time around. Um, and as he was more, vulnerable as an older person in this facility, alone a lot, he really turned to me more and more as his one person, and it was kind of hard because it felt like such a responsibility, especially when he was unhappy, but it also kind of came around to, in a way, I felt like, "Oh gosh, he finally really loves me," or he finally admits that, I'm an important person to him, because that wasn't always quite clear, when I was younger. So, I think it's life is hard and life is complex, although I have a very privileged life. So, but even for those of us who are very privileged, there's a lot of emotions we have to go through. And watching your parents go downhill and trying to manage that and be the one in charge. I was lucky to have a husband who was helpful, but in a way that too was a little bit of a constraint because he had certain expectations. He didn't want When we moved again, he didn't want my dad to live with us again. He had been living with us. It was like, okay, I've had enough of that. He can go to an apartment now, and that kind of thing. So you sort of have to balance your different people in your life and factors and work and all that. Yeah.
absolutely. And balancing caregiving is not easy. And
Not
a lot of
easy.
times
Right.
things get dropped no matter what your situation is. And I do want to go back to the title of your book. The word only daughter
Yeah.
is very powerful in the
Yeah.
caregiving community
Yeah.
because there is an expectation on females more
Yes.
so than males, and that does not mean males can't be great caregivers, because they absolutely can be. But
Sure.
only daughter, that means
Mhm.
the whole burden falls on you. Eldest
Yeah.
daughter also is another
Yeah.
code word. Um,
That's true. Right.
any of those, it tells me that you're, it just such why do you think that is? And what do you think, I don't know, what do you think should be done? Like, what can we do for the future to change this expectation?
Yeah. Well, the expectation is there for sure. Sometimes the female has more of those nurturing emotional IQ kind of skills, but not always, but they're sort of expected to. In my case, I was my mother's only child, and my father had one other child who's my half brother. And there was a kind of a disconnect there where he was not interested in helping our dad at that time because he was just my dad had kind of been a little too controlling in his life, and he was like, no, not interested in helping. And I'm so much older. It was also, we weren't real close. So it was it just sort of fell to me. But in some families, I mean, there are regular, sisters and brothers, and yeah, it's the one sister who will take it, who will get the brunt of it. And sometimes that's because maybe she's not working, or maybe they just think that she has somehow the skills. I don't know. Maybe getting if there's a man involved, getting the sons to come to special support group or something might be good. I have to say, on my husband's behalf, he also had parents. They're hardly in my book because this is really focused sort of on my journey with my parents, but we dealt with his parents, and he did do a lot of travel and supporting his dad especially. So boys and men do help, but yeah, I felt like in my family it was kind of also some of us, it's sort of like when they talk about the alcoholic family. My family wasn't an alcoholic family, fortunately, but there was some of that dynamic where my dad was someone who was kind of difficult, and a little bit there was some low level mental illness going on, and he was the kind of person that made you feel like you had to walk on eggshells sometimes, as the saying goes. And so I think when you've grown up like that, you're sort of a natural caretaker or caregiver. And I always sort of felt like, oh, I better help. I better make sure everybody feels good, and do what I can to smooth things over. And so that was definitely a part of my character.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I know you do talk about your dad's mental illness, and I think you refer to it as blue days
Yeah.
in the book.
Yeah.
And
Right.
that was interesting for me too, because having depression and anxiety myself, like
Mhm.
it was awakening for me, like, am I putting this burden on my children too, um it's hard to be the family caregiver.
It is
Especially
hard.
when you're the only
Yeah.
daughter and that expectation is there.
Mhm.
And, there's the layer of mental illness. There's the layer of that unique childhood experience of your dad kind of doing his own thing, and also the feelings of your dad not wanting kids initially and being
Right.
like, nope, this isn't the life for me. And then, like you said, though, at the end, it was like, hey, wait a minute, I'm glad you were his person. If it weren't
Yeah.
for you, who was going to take care of him?
Right.
And
Right.
I can sort of relate to that in a sense of, I remember I really did not want kids when I was younger,
Mhm.
and having a conversation with my mom and my grandfather at that time, and my grandfather
Mm.
saying, you have to have kids someday, and me looking at him and being like, oh no, I don't.
Right.
I said, I'm going to adopt all the grandparents because grandparents are awesome and kids are sticky,
Yeah.
in the worst. And
Mm.
my grandfather looked at me and he said, well, he said, if you don't, you're going to regret it, because who's going to be there for you when you get older?
Mm. Yeah.
And I don't
Yeah.
want to push the narrative that like you have to have kids, but because you don't, like, if you choose not to,
Right.
not to. Nowadays, there's a lot more personal choice in all that area, but
Yes, for
I
sure.
do want to say, like, it's so heartwarming to hear that he came around
Yeah.
at a point and was like, hey, wait a minute, like, if it weren't for you, where would I be right now?
Yeah, he said that quite a bit towards the end of his days, and it was heartwarming. It was both sort of a burden and a privilege, and sometimes I didn't take that as well because he'll say, he would say, "Oh, I couldn't do it without you." I'm like, "Yeah, I know, because who else is there?" Sort of like, yeah. But then, the fact that he was really the last year or so with COVID and everything, I started to have a lot more empathy for him again, and so
Yeah.
I allowed myself to feel the empathy, and it wasn't so overwhelming, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, because it can be overwhelming, if you feel so sorry for the people that you're trying to help, it it's not as good sometimes. You sort of have to detach a little bit so that you can try to be there for them in a sort of supportive way, but you're not just like, "Oh, it's so sad."
And how was it different for you emotionally caring for your mom and your dad?
My mom and I were always really close. We did sort of fight a little bit as like daughters and mothers do, in their teen years, my 20s. We'd have arguments, but it was like I knew like 1,000% that she loved me and we were just very close. We knew each other very well. Whereas my dad, we didn't fight much because it was like there was that, oh, I can't, cross him because he might, have a bad reaction, or, he's not always accepting or something. But anyway, he wasn't really a bad person at all. That's the thing, you get the idea that he had all these things, but could have been worse. But my mother, by the time she really needed a lot of help, she was more willing though to accept the help and more kind of compliant, and just was okay. She didn't complain a lot. Whereas my dad, oh my, he complained a lot. And so that made it hard. Made it
Yeah.
hard. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, family dynamics affect how we do with caregiving and stuff like that.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and I'm kind of getting to like my final couple questions.
Okay.
Um, and again, I am reading your book. And I want to let the audience know I'm probably about a third of the way through, and I'm
Okay.
thoroughly enjoying it. The Pianist's Only Daughter, and it is a memoir. It takes me forever to read books. I'm sorry, guys.
Yeah.
Um, but
Well, you have a busy life. I don't blame you. And it is right there on Amazon. It's on Kindle and in paperback. And for a while longer, it's free for Kindle Unlimited subscribers if you have that. I think it's going to go off of that like at the end of March. But so right now, those of
oh, yeah.
you, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. And kind of final, my second to last question, my favorite question to
Sure.
always ask my guests. What is your favorite form of self-care?
Well, I think for me, I really enjoy just kicking back and watching like British mysteries on TV. And I do enjoy a good, like, a little bit of chocolate after dinner or a little bit of ice cream, those kinds of things. But I have to say, for me also, the writing was a sort of a very therapeutic, self-caring thing that I did. And, I started with just a little essay about my mom when she went first to the first nursing home, because it was so kind of upsetting how she got sent there on a Saturday night and they didn't have what they needed for her and they didn't have the medication right and all that. And then my dad was upset and then he yelled at me. And so that made a great little like essay. So I wrote that and I was like, "Oh wow, I have a story here." And then I just felt sort of good to be able to get it out and share it. And that, the whole book took me about 3 years, but it has been therapeutic. Yeah. So even if you're not going to write a book, sometimes just journaling, or definitely, talking in a support group, talking to a good friend who doesn't tire of hearing it. I mean, a lot of our friends, it's not their favorite thing to hear us talk about our caregiving journey because, it's kind of a downer for some people, they don't. But if someone's been through it, or if they are the type of person who can just open their heart to that, then it's really useful sometimes to just talk about it.
Absolutely. So what I got from that was go get ice cream with a friend.
Yeah, for sure. Ice cream and coffee, of course, but yes.
I go get ice cream with your friend.
Yeah.
And just chat. You know what? There is nothing wrong with that. And I have a friend
Mhm.
who I think could use a bowl of ice cream, who I might call and make an ice cream
That
place.
sounds good. Yeah, yeah. It's
We
very comforting,
it is. It's comforting, and the littlest things in life, when we take a moment to appreciate them, can be self-care,
Yes,
especially when we incorporate a friend in it, or
yes.
someone special.
Mhm.
It can be self-care. So yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. I love that tip.
Good.
And
Thanks.
again, I love the support group tips, and the journaling is always great. Writing, sharing your story, all that is so important. But ice cream with a friend, I like
Yeah, I like that too. Yeah.
it's so great. So my final question, where can my audience find you for more information?
Well, other than finding the actual book on Amazon, I have a website that just has things about my book, but also essays. It has links to essays, and it's essentially just my name. It's like www, or I guess you have to do HTTP, just kathrynbettsadams.com. And it's the KATHRYN Adams.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And
Yeah.
I'll be sure to link your website and your book on Amazon through our show notes.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. All
Um,
right.
and I want to thank you so much again for your time and chatting with me, sharing your story, talking about your book, sending me
Thank
your book.
you.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to read it, as again, I'm thoroughly enjoying it. Um,
Good. Good.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you for having me. This has just been wonderful. It's been so nice to talk to you, and good luck with your continued excellent work with the Chronicles podcast. It's great. All
Thank you.
right. Take
And
care then. Oh,
that
go ahead.
will wrap up this week's episode of Caregiver Chronicles. If you liked this episode, I ask you to please share it with a friend. If you'd like to support our podcast, you can find links to do so on our website, stelmachbrownmedia.com. But really, the best way to support our podcast and help us out is to share us with one friend and all your friends. And with that, I will see you next week.